Hello, hello, and welcome back to Shatter Our Souls with Novaria. Now, last time we booted up Metroid Prime 2, we ended up beating the Alpha blog, and did a little bit of exploration in the underwater section. Today, I'm hoping to get the final upgrade for the Torvus Bog section, so that hopefully tomorrow, or next week, we can move on to the Sanctuary Fortress. Now, I am cautiously optimistic. I realize that Metroid Prime and Prime 2, for all of its strengths, are not perfect. In fact, I'm going to hazard a statement that absolutely no game in the history of video games in general have ever been perfect. Perfection is unattainable. However, flawed masterpiece, that is a statement that can be given out a lot more open mindedly. Now, I admit I say this with a statement of, or with the belief that video games are going to have their flaws. There's no two games that are going to execute in the exact same way. But in stating that, in saying what I believe here, I want to make sure that it comes from the mentality of I love these games, but I'm not so over the top in love with the franchise as a whole to ignore the faults. In fact, if I'm being honest, that's the best praise I can give. That a game has flaws that I acknowledge. That or a game, an anime, a story have flaws that can be acknowledged and loved all the same. That's my take on this. So I want to be abundantly clear about that. So why do I say this? Um, so if you look at Metroid Prime and its flaws, a lot of its flaws tie into backtracking, where you're going from one end of the world to the other. You're getting to uh, the deepest part of Phendrana drifts, only to turn around and go straight back to the starting area, and so on and so forth. You end up going all over the place multiple times throughout the game, and sometimes it feels like there's no really good reason for it. This is the number one or chief complaint that I see when talking about Metroid Prime. There are a couple of other smaller ones, but this is the number one complaint. And when it comes down to its world building and design, it gets very high praise from the majority of the community that enjoys Prime, through stating that, yeah, it has its issues, but if you look at other games, even newer ones than the Prime trilogy, there's a lot to be enjoyed, a lot to be loved in how they approached these games. And so, if you look at locations like Phendrana Drifts, where it was one of those situations where it was generic in terms of the type of level that it was, and yet it still left you feeling with a feeling of awe, inspiration, and that's an amazing part about Metroid Prime and its world design. It doesn't just stop at good enough. They wanted it to excel. Prime 2 takes the atmosphere of Prime 1 and tries to make it more claustrophobic, more suffocating, more dreary. You're on the tail end of a war that's lasted 20 to 50 years. And so it's understandable that the world as a whole is damaged, it's in decay. And that is something that is very apparent and abundant in the design philosophy of Metroid Prime is this idea of loss, this idea of decay. But it isn't without its flaws. Now, I'm going to talk about this with a level of this game is great, but the duality of the world, the light and dark world, meant that the player effectively had to explore an area once in the overworld, in the light world, and then turn around and go to the dark world. Once again, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. The light world and dark world are unique enough to be considered different. What the issue that I have with it ties into how it functions. The player is effectively put into this no-win scenario, if I may, where it feels like I'm backtracking more than I actually am. Part of this is good design in that they're using elements of both worlds to influence puzzle building on the other. And I like that aspect of it. In fact, I'd say that is one area that they absolutely nailed it. But it always felt as though I was backtracking whenever I went to the dark world, especially in the later game where I'm getting to the point where, yes, they're separate, but they're still very samey. And the nuance, I suppose the difference between A and B is much less pronounced, is the way I'm going to go about it, saying it. And so it is with that mentality that I'm approaching this. There are other issues that come to mind. Boss design is something that Metroid has been kind of iffy on, especially in the 3D series. And I'm not saying this to be nitpicky, but if you look at Metroid Prime's bosses, most of them, or at least a good portion of them, were static enemies. Look at the early game bosses. You had the Hive Mecha, you had the Parasite Queen, you had the Incinerator Drone, you had Flagra, all static enemies in the center of an arena that Samus fought around. The other side of it, what came from the the other ones, the what I'll call the stronger designed bosses, focused in more heavily on certain weaknesses, hitting certain targets to get your opponent to a point where they could take damage, was a commonality between a lot of these guys. Think Thardus, think the Omega Pirate. So there is a lot to be said about their game design philosophy in the Prime games. However, Prime 2 takes the boss design of Prime 1 and tries to dial it up. They wanted the game to have, well, in my understanding, they wanted the game to have a more, to be more difficult than the original. And while that is to be respected, the design philosophy of the bosses, at least in the later portions like Hyper Mode, which was never designed around these, or wasn't initially designed with these games in mind, has some very significant consequences when playing through the game later on. Prime 2's bosses are spongy. They take a lot of hits, even on normal mode. And couple that with the, shall I say, because the bosses are as spongy as they are, they take a lot longer to defeat. Now, sometimes this is just Oh yeah, you get through their shield, you bop them a couple times, they're done. Like a Morbus. Other ones are a lot harder to get a grasp on how strong or how difficult they would be in a dialed up circumstance. A lot of the weaker bosses in the early to mid game just have their invincibility frames pumped up to 11. So, if you recall, a couple weeks ago, I fought the Boost Guardian. And the Boost Guardian was, well, the Guardian was a tank. It took me, what was it, an hour and a half of straight attempts, 14 deaths, just to beat one enemy. And some might say, well, I should have taken some time and got more gear, but the issue is that the gear was never the problem. The problem was the enemy's invincibility phases, where it was so strong that it was next to impossible to deal damage to the monster. And would usually turn around right at the end and get a lucky hit in, and boom, I was done anyways. These situations were unfortunately quite common. So, why do I bring this character back up that is officially done? Done and dusted. Well, the reality of it is that even the mid to late, or more of the mid game bosses, like the Alpha Blog and the, whatchamacallit, the Grapple Guardian, fall into a lot of the same traps and problems that the other bosses have thus far. Now, the Grapple Guardian on normal mode is incredibly strong and probably one of the longest winded bosses out there. Partially because I don't like using ammunition. I do my talk about, I do my voiceover after the fact. I sit down and enjoy these games on my own time. And so I'm not necessarily thinking about efficiency when I play this. I think about my resource management. I'm planning out my routes. I'm looking at ways to improve my likelihood of success. And so, in many ways, I feel like watching my videos are more genuine as far as what an average gamer would actually see, what an average individual would actually experience. The Grapple Guardian has an issue with its invincibility frames. It has higher than average invincibility frames in general. Its weak points are rather limited. So, to get a good weak point on the Grapple Guardian, you need to strike its eye in order to get it from a invulnerable state to a vulnerable state. Once it is vulnerable, you have to deal damage to its back. Now, it specifies the tail as being a weak point, but I've always found underneath the tail to be a more viable option. But sometimes underneath doesn't work, and sometimes over top doesn't work, and either way you look at it, it's unnecessarily frustrating to even get a damaging strike into the Grapple Guardian. This is a well-designed boss turned in a little bit of a frustrating layer, shall we say, or it is made in a frustrating way. It's a well-designed boss. There's no doubt in my mind that it is one of the better and stronger bosses out there. But there's a couple nitpicks to make. The other major nitpick I can make is the ammo system. Now, I've talked at length about how the ammo system of Prime 2 doesn't really work with me. And I'll explain the whole mentality. So for me, psychologically speaking, as I'm sitting down and playing this, I come to the what if I need this later mentality. Which is why I don't use my weapons very often in the overworld. But what if there's a boss I need it more for, and so on and so forth? It's the same issue that hits a lot of players that play RPGs of what if I need this later. And the reality of it is that I will never need it later. But I struggle to actually get out of my habits long enough to be able to actually get what I'm after out of it. I think that makes sense. I struggle to get out of the mentality of what if I will need this later in order to use the weapons that I have. There we go. That's clear and concise, right? Now, on to a little bit of little bit less nitpicky, a little bit more I wonder if. So, if you looked earlier in the channel and the challenges I completed, one of which was on Titanfall, specifically Titanfall 2. And having recently sat down and gave another go through the game because it's one of those games that I love to sit down and go through, play the whole thing start to finish in one sitting because I can. And I got questioning what would happen if Samus needed additional firepower. And so, would Samus ever go the route of having a Titan? And this sounds absolutely ludicrous, but Samus having already been kitted out as much as she is, if we wanted to go the extra mile for Samus's destructive capabilities, I could feasibly see a Titan from Titanfall 2 being the way to go. Or, depending on how you look at it and the size of the enemies she's going up against, a Jaeger from Pacific Rim. I know that absolutely neither of these are likely the route that the developers would go with this. But having recently sat down and played both Titanfall and watched Pacific Rim, the original movie, it really got me thinking about how Samus's kit, for all its strength, all its power, is usually more about infiltration than it is about devastation. And it's something that I personally like about the character because she's always kind of get all your gear on sight kind of character. She's always been stronger than average in that regard. But if ever she knew that she was going into a battle, that she was going to need more firepower, more raw strength, where shall I say, the subtle approach doesn't work, these big, heavy-duty mech that could very well integrate with the Varia suit would be a fantastic boost to her destructive capability. I'm not saying they will, in fact, I doubt they would. But it got me thinking and curious about just how they would build it. Would her suit be nuclear? Would it be powered by phazon? Would it be powered by just general electricity? Would it have a plasma cannon like the Gypsy Danger did? What would it have? Would it focus more heavily on the on a melee aspect, or would it have, like, we don't know? But I'm asking this question due to just how much sense it makes. And it's one of those things that I wish they would take a little bit of creative liberty with to show off what exactly the could be done with it. Now, okay, this boss is a little long-winded, given it's been nearly 10 minutes and I've done next to no damage to this thing. Hoofty. Okay. As I stated prior, its defensive capabilities make this particular enemy much more dangerous than some of the alternative enemies that have shown up. What I like about it is that they took the more generic enemy of the Grenchler and provided a new enemy type, boss enemy, to go with it. And did so in a way that made it feel distinct from the Sheegoth. So, the Grenchler and the Sheegoth have always been a little bit interchangeable for me. They are fought in an identical manner. And I know that's intentional. Reuse some of the ideas because it worked. But the Grenchler as a statement is a little bit on the harder side to, well, is easier to defeat as far as health pool than the Sheegoth were. But the Sheegoth had a much, much greater weakness to the plasma beam, where you could defeat the youth Sheegoth or baby Sheegoth in a single strike with a plasma beam. The Grenchler don't have that. They're much more difficult to really get a heavy hit on than the Sheegoth were. The boss of the Sheegoth was, you need to get close enough to it and drop a couple of bombs at its feet. Its soft underside, its belly, was its weak point. And for the Grapple Guardian, the Grenchler, its underside, or its belly, is also its weak point. But it's done in a way that is unique to it, as the Grenchler has more room for, well, less room for error, more, how you say, the Grenchler has less room for error, and is fought as a armored, like, fully upright standing Samus versus it. So it has a lot less opportunity to deal damage to it as well. To balance this out, they do have two healing springs right in the middle of the arena. Well, on either end of the arena, that act both as cover and as a means of locking your opponent in an animation, if only briefly, so that you can deal damage to it. Like I said, well-designed boss, slightly poor execution. And I'm going to say that a lot. I love Prime 2. I love what it brought to the table. I think it is a fantastically well-designed game. But I also believe that their over-reliance on invincibility phases makes many of the bosses stay far longer than they need to. But all the complaints or nitpicks I could throw at this are not are just that. They're nitpicks. If you played, you know those games where they're a little bit janky when you first play it and they're meant to be a full long game and they're just kind of you get maybe 2 hours out of it and you're done. Well, I believe that there are many games that have that 2 hour mentality. They're what I call shovelware. They are quickly designed games meant to get something on the market very quickly that don't necessarily have a whole lot of content. Shovelware titles are kind of simplistic in nature. Metroid Prime, Prime 2, and Prime 3 are shorter than your average AAA title. At least as far as a fully single player game is. But what it lacks in overall time, it makes up for in the quality of the content. And I think that says a fair bit about the design of the games as a whole. Every area in Prime 1, 2, and 3 is meticulously designed. Does it have flaws? Certainly. Every game does. But it's designed to make every area, each region, distinct from one another. Now, admittedly, the last game I played in the trilogy was Prime 2. And my start to the franchise was through Metroid Prime 3. And when I played through it, I was kind of like, oh yeah, Norion is a kind of a generic space area, nothing super serious about it. I got to Brio and thought, oh, they really one up themselves here. And then I got to Elysia. Elysia was hands down was and is one of my favorite sci-fi locations in all of fiction. And I say that from how it's designed, from its world. You can tell that time was put into the architecture of this world and how the world itself, like each area of the game was meticulous, was planned out, was thought through in its entirety. Prime 2 never lost that. Prime 1 never lost that. Every single location leaves you feeling a sense of awe, of empowerment, of history. History in general, which is something that you don't get very often. Now, the best way I can describe that feeling is I had an opportunity about 10 years ago now to travel to India. And one of the temples that we visited, it was near Udaipur. And it was a temple designed with the mentality of every single one of the pillars, intricately carved, was perfectly symmetrical on all sides. And so you could get even just a glimpse into the type of culture that was around the time of this temple's building. Now, I'm using this as an example, but that's kind of what I'm getting at with Metroid Prime. There's so much that they did right in terms of world building and architecture and everything that it's very difficult to just to go into an area and not think, what did they used to do here? What was this area actually meant for? Now, in Prime 2, it's a little bit easier because we're dealing with, ow, monkey, 4 separate temples. Sorry, my cat just bit me. You're dealing with 4 separate temples on various pieces of the globe as a whole on Aether. You have the temple in Agon Wastes that used to have a battle arena in it. It was more of a chivalrous test. It was a test of the strength of its people. Agon Wastes used to be a paradise of sorts. It was green fields. And so the culture around it was much more about agriculture in that area. The Torvus Bog used to be a lush rainforest, and while it definitely hasn't lost the rainforest aspect, it has become decayed. It was lost time. The inner workings of their temple, which used to be a water purification plant, or something of that nature, still functions to this day in a reduced capacity. But this is one of those few areas where you can actually see a difference between the two worlds. The light world has Agon Waste, has Torvus Bog focusing more so on the the rainforest aspect, the destruction and decay aspect above, and the pools of water that have flooded the lower sections of the temple in the light world are missing in the dark world, showing in what way the world has changed and grown, or has changed over time. This is a minor detail, but you can find these types of things all over the place. And once again, it's one of those good design, bad design, and could be stated in either way. Hey, let go of me. So, yeah. But I personally have always been a sucker for the Sanctuary Fortress on Inghive. Now, the Sanctuary Fortress and Inghive are difficult for me to just say which would prefer. I love that region. The music, the very intentional way it is carried. It holds itself to this high regard. You can see small drones repairing the areas around the fortress as a whole. And it becomes more of a question of how to get around, not a question of where to go. Jumping in and out of the light and dark worlds, trying to find your way through, while you pick up additional gear so that you can get through more efficiently later. All of this ties back into each other and is probably one of my more... It would be in my top 3 locations in the series at this point. with Elysia being number one. And some might say, well, you like the more metallic, the more synthetic environments. And that's true. I do. But the thing with it is the synthetic environments, sometimes they can be done incredibly poorly. Look at these synthetic, well, the iron hallways of Other M and its lush sections. And you'll see a very distinct difference between the two of them. Prime 1, 2, and 3 all have these synthetic and natural environments that it focuses in on. But each of these environments that we get to see in the trilogy are all treated very well. But even the synthetic environments that you can find in Other M pale in comparison to Elysia, to Skytown, to the Sanctuary Fortress. Heck, it is nothing compared to the Phazon Mines. And so, if you look at the different locations and how they're treated, you can get a much better understanding of their worlds, but also you can get a better appreciation for the artists that created these worlds. And I think, personally, that if we could all step back and appreciate games as more of an art form, then I think we would be all the better for it. Now, I say it like this because there are numerous games that outdo themselves, that don't just stop at good design or don't just stop at a fun mechanic. There are games like Metroid Prime, like the trilogy, like Shadow of the Colossus, Ico, that try to tell a story in a different way. They try to get more and ask more. They ask more of the individual sitting down and enjoying these games than I think most people would be aware of. They do ask a lot of the player. But the difference between the player getting a chance to interact with the world and a player dealing with the aftermath of an apocalypse or trying to pick up the pieces of a dying civilization. Each and every one of these games has more that they're trying to get the player to engage with. And it's something that, as shown with numerous video game movies, it shouldn't be asked lightly. And I don't think is ever asked lightly of the players. When you take a layer away from the interactivity, you begin to find more simple statements, shall we say. A video game is always going to have more engagement than a movie. A movie may have more, may have less engagement than a book. Video games are the most interactive and most closely aligned with the player as a whole. The intent being that the player gets to make their decisions and actually have something more to show for it. Metroid Prime doesn't just ask you to play the game, finish it, and be done. It asks you to it almost demands more of the player to ask why the world got to the state it did. And this is a common statement among video games that have a more in-depth story. Be that as it may, this has gone on a little bit longer than I was planning. So if you like what you see, drop a like, leave a comment down below. We'll catch you next time, where we'll be starting up in the light world at the save station above, or a little bit higher up. Until next time, I hope you have a good one.